to thank everybody for coming out on a Saturday evening. It's such a nice day outside, and you came inside to come listen to us talk about not just breakthrough news, but independent media, which is so important. So before I get into what I mostly want to talk about, which is what we've witnessed in terms of all the lies, the tsunami of propaganda with regards to the genocide in Gaza, I want to talk a little bit about my personal journey coming into journalism, because unlike most of my colleagues who come out of movements and organizing and activism, I actually have a different story. So let me start here. I didn't study journalism. I didn't study political science. I actually have a degree in exercise physiology, which I never used. Did you not know that about me? Okay, so you guys are learning something new about me. So yes, I have a degree that I unfortunately had to take out student loans for because we live in America, that I do not use. And I actually almost went to nursing school. Not to knock nursing. Nursing is an amazing profession. I encourage anybody who wants to be a nurse to go into it. But I didn't end up going to nursing school because of independent media. So back in the day, I know I was a very good liberal. I guess you could call me a good liberal. I'm not slandering myself. I was a good one. But basically, I was pro-choice. I opposed wars because my family's Middle Eastern and most of them have fled wars that America has caused. So that was just kind of a default instinct I have. I grew up going to Palestine protests, but that was sort of the limits of my political understanding. And then 2008 comes along and Barack Obama is the Democratic candidate for president. And so it's the McCain-Obama election and his middle name was Hussein. So I was like, oh my God, this guy's maybe not going to bomb the Middle East. Like, his middle name's Hussein. That was literally my thinking. So I had to find out everything I could about Obama's foreign policy views to see if maybe he wasn't going to bomb the Middle East. Maybe he'd be different on Palestine. And I completely unintentionally stumbled across in some episode of Democracy Now! I don't even remember what it was about. And Democracy Now! Was a bit different then. I think it was a much better program than it is now. But it took me down this rabbit hole. Suddenly, for the first time, I was exposed to Noam Chomsky and manufacturing consent and Naomi Klein and disaster capitalism, which I later learned was just capitalism. Ali Abunimah and the electronic intifada, somebody who became such a mentor of mine in journalism because I ended up working there eventually. Vijay Prashad and the anti-imperialist struggle, Michelle Alexander and the new Jim Crow, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. I remember there was a guy who wrote the book Lies My Teacher Told Me, and I went and bought that, and I just read it angrily for like a week. And I was like, I've been lied to about everything. But the reason I tell this story is because independent media, Democracy Now! Started it, but then I ended up, reading other outlets that were independent online. And, I became familiar with organizers and activists. It's where I learned objectivity is bullshit and you can't be neutral on a moving train. Shout out to Howard Zinn. But independent media literally radicalized me in a way I otherwise wouldn't have been radicalized. And so this is what pulled me into journalism. Like, I couldn't go back. I was red-pilled. And I've never looked back. And I tell this story because I want breakthrough news to play a similar role in informing people about what's actually happening in the world, because the truth is really powerful. It's why, as Ben pointed out, the ruling class spends billions of dollars lying to us because they have to justify this disgusting system they've created. So this is the power of independent anti-imperialist media. And amidst the Gaza genocide, our role is more crucial, I think, than ever. And I'm not going to pretend it's easy. We're living in an era of, you have 8 of the wealthiest people in the world have more average wealth than the bottom half of humanity. We say that a lot, but think about that statistic. 8 people have more wealth than 4.6 billion people. That's an atrocious system. And then many of these individuals, help fund some of the biggest media outlets in the world. They help shape the narrative that people are fed, which is important for them, right? Because they need to spread a narrative that justifies this outrageously unequal system. And in the US specifically, that comes out to 5 corporations owning 90% of the democratic and free media that people listen to, watch, consume. And it's because they have a stake in maintaining this international imperial order that benefits them. They promote the State Department narrative about the rest of the world, whether it's justifying genocide in Gaza or justifying the overthrow of governments in Iraq and Libya and Syria, or sanctioning Venezuela and Iran, or labeling Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism, or escalating a dangerous Cold War against Russia and China. And sadly, at times, they're very successful in shaping American opinion. They convince a lot of Americans that up is down, that resistance is terrorism, that genocide is self-defense. And we see this, of course, playing out in the way the corporate media covers up and justifies Israel's genocide in Gaza. And we're put in this position where we have to convince people that Arab life, that Palestinian life, does in fact matter, that it's not okay to murder hundreds of Palestinians a day, that colonialism and supremacy and imperialism are extremely violent and wrong, that people actually do have a right to defend against it, and that opposing Israeli genocide is not a form of bigotry, that our system is completely broken. Meanwhile, the destruction in Gaza continues seemingly without end, and as these heart-shattering and infuriating images of shredded children fill our screens and the justifications for crushing them continues, it's like just when you think the horrors can't get worse, the dehumanization can't get worse, the hate can't get worse, the media justifications can't get worse, they actually do. It's like no matter what Israel does, these American bobbleheads from both parties and their media stenographers unconditionally support and defend the slaughter, giving Israel an endless supply of weapons, intelligence assistance, and diplomatic cover while blaming Palestinians for whatever horror the Israelis inflict on them. And they do it all while suppressing dissent here at home and demonizing anybody who stands against it. But I will point out, I think they're still losing because of Palestinians, first and foremost, on the ground, bravely reporting their reality. And because we also have to shout out Israelis on TikTok egomaniacally celebrating their heinous crimes. But also, I think because of independent media. Because of all this, the majority of Americans support a ceasefire, and an increasing number of Americans actually support cutting off arms to Israel. That's huge. That has never happened. And that's why the ruling class, we should applaud that. Good job, Americans. But that is why the ruling class has to censor people and fire people and suspend people. It's why they have to lie about a Hamas mass rape hoax and 40 beheaded babies, which they've never apologized for. As the truth becomes impossible to cover up, though, they are increasingly desperate. They're challenged by outlets like ours, running on a shoestring budget, but growing immensely and punching far above our weight. Because people know they're being lied to, especially younger people. Yeah, they're flooded with a tsunami of propaganda, but at the same time, they recognize that their views are not reflected at all in their elected leadership. They recognize that their lives are actually more difficult than their parents' lives. They have no safety net, while our parasitic leaders spend trillions of dollars maintaining U.S. military control over everything. What is it? The most lethal fighting force in the world, as Kamala Harris puts it. And this new generation is now traumatized by the live-streamed atrocities Palestinians are enduring and showing the world. Atrocities our leadership defends and denies. That's why we're, as Ben pointed out, approaching 2 million followers on all of our social media platforms and constantly growing. People are hungry for the truth, and it's the genocide in Palestine has really exposed the imperialist narrative of the mainstream media, and I would say even beyond Palestine, at least it potentially can. The mainstream media has spent 11 months calling an obvious genocide the Hamas-Israel war. That's all meant to distract from the horrors being committed against 2.3 million people in the Gaza death camp, right? But this also raises some questions. If they lied about 40 beheaded babies, about Hamas committing mass rape atrocities, and they're also actively ignoring the actual gang rapes of Palestinians by Israelis, which are on video, if they're covering up Israel's use of the Hannibal Directive, which killed their own people on October 7th, And they're ignoring the summary executions of doctors and patients in Gaza's hospitals. If they promoted Israel's fabrication about Shifa Hospital being a Hamas headquarters to justify dismantling Gaza's healthcare facilities, another lie they've never, ever apologized for, the question becomes, what else is the media lying about, right? People see, and we're also constantly highlighting at Breakthrough News, that if the media lies this much about Palestinians, perhaps they're also lying about other adversary countries that the US wants to destabilize, right? Maybe they're lying about China. Maybe they're lying about Iran and Venezuela and Cuba. Gaza is an inflection point that's permanently discrediting the corporate media to much of this generation. I totally plagiarized that from Ben, but it's a great line. But that's, again, where we come in. We exist to challenge their lies, their narratives about terrorism and armed resistance. We're here to remind them that every Israeli accusation is actually a confession. It's Israel that intentionally burns and beheads Palestinian children with US-supplied bunker buster bombs. It's Israel that's systematically using rape as a weapon and also is using Palestinians as human shields. And it's Israel that's helping expose itself because they're bragging about it. We're also here to remind them that colonized people have a right to resist. And for the first time in our lifetimes, the people of the region are organized and they're fighting for their survival in a way that has shaken the leadership in Brussels and Washington. You know, I live in Beirut, Lebanon. That's where I record most of my episodes for Dispatches. And oh my God, the internet at the other side of imperialism is not the easiest, you guys. I had to work really hard to make that work, but it works, and I'm really happy it does. Because, you know, I live in a place where every single day, the Israelis threaten to bring about the apocalypse. They threaten to turn Lebanon into Gaza. The only reason that hasn't happened in Lebanon is because of a group called Hezbollah. The US labels Hezbollah an Iranian proxy terrorist group, but many Lebanese see them as a force of deterrence, as the only thing standing in the way of the sort of Israeli genocide and rape dungeons we see in Gaza. The opinions of these Lebanese people who view this, the Israelis, who view Hezbollah as an existential defensive fighting force against a settler colony, their views are totally absent in mainstream corporate media. The same goes for the way that Ansar Allah, the Yemeni group that is more commonly referred to in the US as the Houthis, the way that they're covered in US media, if they get any coverage at all. The same goes for Iraqi resistance groups. I mean, that's the most insane one, by the way. Anytime the Iraqis hit like an American military base, it's called terrorism. In what world is it terrorism to attack a military that is in your country? It's completely insane. But regardless, then you have the way that Palestinian armed resistance groups are framed. I mean, literally, Palestinian kids throwing rocks at US-supplied Israeli tanks are called terrorists or framed as though they're like violent criminals. But we, of course, challenge that entire narrative. Despite operating under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, we also remind our viewers that Israel has yet to even achieve a military victory after 11 months of genociding Gaza. At Breakthrough News, we show this perspective from, again, the people on the other side of imperialism. We've had on Palestinians from Gaza, from the West Bank, Palestinians from Lebanon, including people in resistance groups. We've had on the second in command of Hezbollah. We've had on a member of the Houthi leadership. We've actually had on one of the leaders of Hamas in Lebanon. Because it's important for people to hear from the people that are demonized by the US government in their own words, not filtered by CNN or the CIA. Just let's hear what they have to say. This is part of doing journalism. And this sort of coverage isn't limited to Gaza. At Breakthrough News, I am proud to say this is how we cover the entire world from the perspective of those in the global South who are a part of movements resisting empire and trying to preserve their independence and sovereignty. Before the genocide in Gaza, the major headline was West African countries kicking out the French. And we were one of the only outlets providing coverage of the people's movements behind those developments. In fact, I would say, not to toot our own horn, but I'm going to toot it anyway, as far as English language outlets in North America, we are one of the only ones regularly covering developments across Africa. I mean, this is a continent of 1.4 billion people that's constantly exploited by the West. I mean, Europe literally lives like a parasite off of Africa, yet the nuances and social movements on that continent are almost completely ignored. And also, we were just in Venezuela to provide truthful coverage of the elections as the US and the New York Times backed yet another failed fascist coup attempt. All that's to say, at the core of our coverage is the anti-imperialist struggle, which requires centering what imperialism means. And Gaza is the most extreme version of what US imperialism looks like. And Palestinians are bravely showing us from there what it looks like. And we're bringing those images as well as coverage of the mass mobilizations in the US to people here because, like Ben said, it gets ignored by CNN and MSNBC. And it's important to understand what Israel means. And I appreciate about Breakthrough News that we offer this context as well. Zionism is a European settler colonial movement that was implanted in the Middle East to control resources and geopolitics to the benefit of the imperialist West. Israel is an arm of US imperialism in the region. And that's why the West is so willing to sacrifice its so-called rules-based order to protect its vassal state, Israel. Gaza's how far they're willing to go to protect their hegemony. That's why none of us are safe in this US-led order. It's a system led by greed and hate. And at the end of the day, we're all killable in their hierarchy of humanity. It just matters where we stand on that ladder. This moment of imperialism on steroids, it seeks to destroy and punish anyone who refuses to submit to this current order, whether it's students at Columbia University or a Palestinian kid throwing a rock at a US-funded Israeli tank. They're literally willing to carry out a genocide as punishment. They want to stop us from building a better world, a liberated world. And so I don't mean to veer off on this tangent about the nature of imperialism, but it's important we recognize this because there are lots of independent media outlets that are out there that produce really good content, and do criticize US policy. But sometimes they focus a little too much, I would say, on the role of the Israel lobby, for example. It's important, but that's not what's actually driving US policy. Or in some cases, there are independent media outlets that will still demonize, the official bad countries the US hates. And I think this is what makes Breakthrough News unique. We're unapologetic when it comes to opposing imperialism. And we have lots of challenges. It's not easy. I think one of those challenges, and maybe this is like something people will want to discuss because you mentioned discussion groups, you've got this kind of dictatorship of the algorithm, right? I mean, the algorithm does work against us a lot, and we're always talking about how to deal with that. But we also use their tools to our advantage to the best we can. On the one hand, everyone's feeds are deluged with CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and like the Colbert Report, which is really annoying. I don't follow it, but YouTube still feeds it to me. And then, all the while, Israel's genocide in Gaza forces Palestinian kids, this is like a new dystopian thing, to make these Instagram accounts to create interesting content to gain followers and basically donations to survive. It's really disgusting algorithmic Hunger Games. They like cook and dance and sing and show us their daily lives, and they try to be engaging with these like smiles and pleasant words. I'm sure you guys see them on Instagram, while you can hear Israeli drones buzzing overhead, and there's like obvious genocide around them. They literally perform on video so they can survive. And it's shameful that this is what our Western governments have created in Gaza. But at the same time, it also provides a lens into Gaza. These citizen journalists in Gaza are using these tools to show us the truth that Israel has tried so desperately to hide. And the social media platforms that the ruling class controls are also used by us to post viral videos so you can see when protests are happening. It's really a double-edged sword, but it's also important that we don't cede these spaces to the imperialists, because some people just want to disengage. Like, why bother using Twitter or Instagram when it works against us? But that's where people are. So we need to use them to the best of our ability. Another big challenge for us and any independent media outlet is funding. We don't have corporate sponsors with limitless funds, yet we're competing with people that do. So we always have to look for ways to diversify revenue. And in many ways, we end up having to depend on our audience, which isn't easy. Another huge challenge is censorship, right? We always have to be careful with how we phrase things and be as accurate as possible. I mean, one, this is because it's ethical journalism, but also because these social media platforms are looking for any reason to remove us They don't always even need a reason. I mean, just this week, the electronic intifada was banned from live streaming on YouTube for like a week for literally no reason. And, you know, Ali Abu Nima he was a mentor for me in journalism. And one of the main things I learned from him is that we are under a microscope and we don't have space to ever get anything wrong. So this is somebody who is so incredibly meticulous, and YouTube still censored him and his outlet. We also have to deal with being smeared, right? We're smeared as dictator lovers and authoritarian and like, I don't know, China stooges, Hamas stooges, Venezuela stooges, whatever, name the country America hates, and we're their stooges because we don't want to bomb that country. But in this case, we have to be unapologetic and stand by our principles. And you know, some people think we can change the mainstream media from the inside. Now, good luck with those who try. But this to me is like saying we can change the Democratic Party from the inside. Which I vehemently disagree with, because both the Democratic Party and the corporate media are beholden to the interests that fund them, meaning like weapons companies and oligarchs. These outlets are not going to change as long as their funders are Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. And it's of course important to pressure them, right, to expose them, to mock them, but they're going to keep lying because that's what lines their pockets. That's why we don't just hate the media, but we want to replace it by creating our own that can compete with them, right? That can force the truth into the mainstream, that can have its own ecosystem that won't be co-opted, that exists outside of them. And I think we've made such an impact that they can't ignore us entirely, to the point that sometimes we manage to break through and they invite us onto their shows. That's how I ended up on Piers Morgan a few months ago. You know, it was like me against 4 crazy people. But it was really cool. It was really, really stressful, and you guys helped me prepare for it, but I got to wipe the floor with a bunch of racists. It was awesome. And also because of that, that interaction, more people got to know what Breakthrough News is. So we actually used their platform to promote Breakthrough News. But I think our growth shows that there is space to alter the model by involving others through things like disruptors, especially. I think this is super important in the way that platforms, we platform people who are in the movements in this country and in the global South from the other side of imperialism. Especially in an increasingly multipolar world, I think October 7th triggered the West's worst anxieties, right? A bunch of brown people in the global South shot at their plantation owners. And people in DC and Brussels worried there could be more of this. So they aren't only practicing these like high-tech methods for obliterating a population in Gaza. They're setting a new precedent on every level, not just on actual warfare on the ground, but on information warfare, like Ben mentioned. In the near future wars of imperialism, it'll be hard to, I think, match the horrors of Gaza, but they're really expanding the goalposts of barbarity right now. And it's terrifying, but I think it also shows that there's a crisis of imperialism at the moment. And it's in moments of crisis that movements rise up to demand change. And I think the media sphere is a huge part of that. They manufacture consent. Well, we want to manufacture dissent against a parasitic ruling elite that's literally prepared to destroy the world to save their imperialist order. They want us to feel isolated and alone and helpless, like we're losing. Gaza is the first live stream genocide, and it's traumatizing all of us. But again, it's live streamed because the people of Palestine are live streaming it, as the people of the world are fighting back from here to there. The world will never be the same because of this. And it is an opportunity for those of us in the media who want to build a better world. So I'm glad that we can come together in a space like the Lovely People's Forum and help forge a path towards that vision. So free Palestine, free the media, let's go.